Good morning to you all. My name is Agnieszka Jelnicka, and I work as a policy officer in the in the higher education unit at the Directorate General for Education at the European Commission. It's a great pleasure to take part in an event organized by the Association for European Life Sciences Universities in Warsaw. And I will present today the Council recommendation on a European approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning and employability. I do not know how many of you are familiar with the recommendation, so I will present it in some detail. And for those who are familiar with the concept, it will be a recap. I will, however, finish my presentation by highlighting current or potential challenges that you may want to discuss during the coming roundtable. Okay. So as some of you might be aware, the recommendation was adopted by the Council in June last year. The recommendation builds on the European Skills Agenda, European Education Area Communication, and the Digital Education Action Plan, and it delivers also on the European Strategy for Universities. Well, let's move on to the rationale of the Council recommendation, its scope, and its basic elements. So what were the reasons for the adoption of the Council recommendation? Well, micro-credentials are spreading across Europe and the world. They are being offered across a broad range of sectors, including product-focused, such as, for example, engineering, manufacturing, construction, and ICT, as well as service-focused, such as health, education, business, administration, and law. However, the value and understanding of micro-credentials is not always clear. There's a wide range of providers, for example, education and in the education training sector or in the private sector. And there are some questions on quality, transparency, and uptake of micro-credentials between and within countries, between sectors, from one job to another. Besides that, a growing number of individuals needs to update their knowledge and skills with a view of the green and digital transition. And the Council recommendation is supposed to remedy this situation. Now let's move on to the objectives. So the objectives of the Council recommendation are following. It's to help people acquire knowledge, skills, and competences they need on the changing labor market. It's to help providers to be better prepared so that they can enhance the quality and transparency and flexibility of the learning offer, and to foster inclusiveness and equal opportunities. So, for example, micro-credentials are a way for those who cannot afford to spend months or years in training to still have some access to some form of education and build on it little by little, like, for example, those who dropped out early from school. Now, there are several important points concerning micro-credentials that I need to highlight. Micro-credentials can be used to complement and enhance education, training, lifelong learning, and employability ecosystems. However, micro-credentials are not to replace or disrupt existing systems or qualifications. They rather complement and enhance them. As for the scope of the recommendation, the recommendation establishes a common European approach to the ongoing and emerging provision of micro-credentials. And the recommendation sets out the definition and guidance for the design, issuance, and description of micro-credentials. Now, one point to remember, the initiative establishes building blocks to develop an EU approach to micro-credentials. So there is a common definition of micro-credentials, union standard elements to describe a micro-credentials, and union principles for design and issuance of micro-credentials. Okay, so we are going to go through all those building blocks, and we are going to start off with the definition of micro-credentials. So a micro-credential means the record of the learning outcomes that a learner has acquired following a small volume of learning. These learning outcomes have been assessed against transparent and clearly defined criteria. This is the definition as it stands in the recommendation. There are some additional clarifications, and you can see them on the slide. I'm going to skip those clarifications, but what's important to remember is that all elements of these clarifications reflect the standards and principles as defined in the Council recommendation. So they reflect the second and the third building block. Now, the EU standard elements to describe a micro-credentials are basically following. The learner needs to be identified, of course. There's an indication of the title of micro-credentials. There is an indication of the country or region that issued a micro-credential, awarding bodies, date of issuance, learning outcomes, and the notional workload needed to achieve the learning outcome in ECTS credit points wherever possible. The level and cycle, if applicable, also the type of assessment, form of participation in the learning activity, and type of quality assurance used to underpin the micro-credentials. There's also some optional information that can be included in a micro-credential. Now, okay, let's move on to the union principles for design and issuance of micro-credentials. So there are 10 of them: quality, transparency, relevance, valid assessment, learning pathways, recognition, portability, and micro-credentials are also learner-centered and authentic. And there needs to be information and guidance on micro-credentials in the lifelong learning services. Let me explore the principles a little bit further. So with regard to quality, micro-credentials are subject to internal and external quality assurance by the system producing them. External quality assurance is based primarily on the assessment of providers rather than individual courses and on the effectiveness of their internal quality assurance procedures. About transparency, micro-credentials are measurable, comparable, understandable, with clear information on learning outcomes, workload, content level, and the learning offer. As for relevance, micro-credentials should be designed as distinct and targeted learning achievements. With regard to valid assessment, micro-credential learning outcomes are assessed against transparent standards. With regard to learning pathways, micro-credentials are designed to support flexible learning pathways, including the possibility to stack, validate, and recognize micro-credentials from across different systems. And obtaining micro-credentials is possible on the basis of assessment of learning outcomes resulting from non-formal and informal learning as well. Now, let's move on to recognition. So recognition, the principle of recognition highlights the value of learning outcomes for smaller modules of learning. So micro-credentials are recognized by all as something that has some sort of value. It's a real proof that the person has learned something. People understand what a micro-credential certifies and they trust it. And also, micro-credentials can be officially recognized as a qualification in the legal framework in order to support the recognition of its value by the employer. And of course, if issued by formal education providers, micro-credentials are recognized for academic and employment purposes based on standard recognition procedures used in recognizing foreign qualifications and learning periods abroad. With regard to portability, micro-credentials are owned by the learner and may be stored and shared easily, including through secure digital wallets on the Europass website, based on the open standards and data models. Micro-credentials are designed to meet the needs of the target groups of learners, so they are learner-centered. Micro-credentials are authentic, so they contain sufficient information to check the identity of the learner, the issuer, the date and location of issuance of the micro-credentials. And finally, there needs to be information and advice on micro-credentials in lifelong learning guidance services, and it should reach the broadest possible learner groups. Now, we have covered the 3 building blocks of the initiative. And we are going to move on to the recommendations. So as a point of precision, any council recommendation has the same structure. also the one that I'm talking about now. First, there are recitals, so reasons for adoption of a given recommendation. Then there are recommendations for member states and given to the Commission. Finally, there are some provisions on monitoring and reporting. But of course, we are talking about soft law, European Union soft law. Now, let's move on to the recommendations that were given to member states. So as you can see, there are 6 of them, and some of them are quite straightforward. They are invited to adopt a definition, to adopt the standards, to adopt principles for design and issuance. They also are asked to develop an ecosystem for microcredentials, to deliver on the potential of microcredentials, and to implement the recommendation. Well, so some of them are straightforward, as I said, but what does it mean to develop an ecosystem for microcredentials? Actually, it means creating an enabling system made of various providers, national qualification frameworks, quality assurance mechanisms, and social dialogue actors, so employers as well. Okay, let's move on to the next recommendation that is included in the Council recommendation. So member states are recommended to deliver on the potential of microcredential. What does it mean? It means that they are invited to encourage, they are encouraged to include microcredentials in national catalogs of education and training courses. They are encouraged to use microcredentials to improve access to education and training for all learners, including disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. They are encouraged to use microcredential to support the transition from upper secondary or vocational education training to tertiary education, and to and the completion of degree programs. They are also encouraged to use microcredentials to improve basic and advanced digital skills, and to promote the understanding and use of microcredentials through continuing professional development for teachers and trainers, as well as academics and researchers. Well, with regard to the Commission, it is supposed to assess and evaluate the progress made in implementation and report to the Council within 5 years from the date of adoption. And finally, okay, so what can the Commission do to support member states? So there are 4 ways. Basically, the Commission can develop and adapt EU existing tools to for example, to further develop the Europass platform or other technical tools such as the European digital credentials. And the bottom line is that the Commission is going to modify tools that already exist. We are not going to create any new tools. The Commission is also technically implementing the Council recommendation through Europass, for example, through the development of secure digital wallets. What can I say about Europass? The Europass has been adapted to Annex 1 of the Council recommendation. And the infrastructure for the European digital credentials for learning already supports the issuing of micro-credentials as digital credentials. In the future, the European digital credentials for learning are going to include a specific credential template for micro-credentials. And there's going to be also some kind of documentation for education training providers so that they can understand the infrastructure and issue micro-credentials as European digital credentials for learning. Now, the Commission can also support cooperation between member states and stakeholders, for example, through organizing peer learning activities, or it can focus on research and data collection, for example, through commissioning studies. I'm going to come back a little bit later to those points. Well, it goes without saying that the Commission supports micro-credentials through different funding schemes, with resources being provided to various stakeholders. With regard to Erasmus+, funding for micro-credential has been, of course, planned in the Erasmus+ work program for 2023. And as is the case, there are 2 priorities covering micro-credentials. And I'm talking about priorities in the area of higher education. So the first priority is on the innovative teaching and learning approaches, including exploring the possibilities for take-up, validation, recognition of short learning courses, leading to micro-credentials. And also there's another priority on supporting green higher education systems. And there's also third priority, but it focuses more on vocational education and training. We are working already on the draft program for 2024, but at this stage, this is still work in progress, of course. Now, the Council recommendation sets out a framework for issuance of micro-credentials, but it is not a magic wand. It needs to be translated into practice. It can be done only by the stakeholders, so national authorities, higher education institutions, training providers, and other stakeholders. And as usual, the devil is in the details. So actually, I haven't included a slide on challenges, but I would like to name a few. As I said before, micro-credentials are spreading across the world, but as they are a relative novelty, the challenges that we face now are also related to the fact that micro-credentials are a novelty, and they appear at different levels, policy making, so to say, national and institutional. Let's move on first to the policy making level. Since micro-credentials are a relative novelty in the education and training world, there is still not enough evidence. In fact, there are some patterns that can be discerned, but evidence still remains scarce. This is one of the findings from the OECD publications. And actually, considering a relative lack of available data, the Commission's launched a study that is being performed by the OECD, which will and the study will feed into developing guidance for member states in the field of monitoring. Well, this particular project provides technical assistance to several EU member states in developing national measures to implement the recommendations. The OECD supports EU member states through strengthening the evidence base on the potential of micro-credentials and related challenges. And the OECD also gives some suggests some practical steps that EU member states need to take. Based on the cooperation with the 4 participating member states, the OECD will define a set of indicators that all EU member states may use to monitor progress in policy development and implementation. And of course, the results will be disseminated at different events. Well, actually, the OECD has published a study where it examines available statistics, and you may want to look into it. And according to their findings, the success or effectiveness of micro-credentials depends on finding the right program for the right learning profile. In other words, micro-credentials need to be relevant to a given learner. What are the other findings? Micro-credentials can increase the probability of being recruited, at least in the short-term run. And in some cases, micro-credentials can lead to better quality employment. However, these depend largely upon the program, the course provider, and the characteristics of the learner. So I think I'm going maybe to put together a list of links to different publications by the OECD or the CDFOP, and then I'm going to send it to Simon and so that he can circulate them. Now, let's move on to another level that I would call national. So this topic is very, very complicated. Well, so I'm going just to focus on several points. Well, at national level, it seems that some systems might need to adapt themselves to micro-credentials, particularly in the field of recognition and portability. Having said that, there are different regulatory systems. Sometimes the legislation does not regulate micro-credentials by specific references to them, but it allows for their provision or regulates them in an implied way. Well, it seems that problems might appear, for example, in federal countries where different regulatory frameworks might be developed in different regions. With regard to quality assurance, there is an ongoing 3-year study on implementation and innovation of quality assurance through peer learning. It is supposed to finish this year, and it supports the work of the Bologna thematic peer group on quality assurance. And based on a survey, the working group is actually conducting a desk research on higher education institutions and non-higher education providers in the area of micro-credentials, of course. And the IMINQA project focuses on quality assurance in the broad sense. And as I already mentioned, it also focuses on some specific topics, among others, micro-credentials. Well, what can I say about the IMINQA research papers point to the findings of the previous project, Microball. And actually, the Microball projects fed into the preparatory work on the country recommendation. Well, the study, the Microball study concluded that the external quality assurance should ensure that the higher education institutions offering micro-credentials have a reliable and well-built system to monitor the quality internally. And the Microball project concluded also that the European standards and guidelines are applicable to micro-credentials and emphasized the principle that the primary responsibility for the quality of provision lies with the education providers. Well, as I said before, the devil is in the details, and details need to be discussed at national level. So as far as I know, member states have been undergoing or are undergoing or about to start discussions to include micro-credentials in their systems. And some of you might be already involved in those processes. Finally, there is the institutional level. At institutional level, higher education and training providers might need to consider stackability of micro-credentials they are to develop, which is not an easy task. The bottom line is that it's up to higher education institutions or other providers to decide what kind of courses they want to propose. Stackability as one of the underlying principles of the Council recommendation means that micro-credentials can be accumulated and grouped over time, building into a larger, more recognizable credential. And I'm already anticipating some questions because they are being asked very often. The Council recommendation does not specify whether one can stack short courses to receive a full degree. It also doesn't indicate how many ECTS points should be assigned to micro-credentials courses. Well, one of the OECD studies provides a comparison of identified micro-credential programs and their associated number of credit points. So the identified individual courses ranged from 1 credit point to 60 credit points, with 60 ECTS credit points being the equivalent of 1 year of full-time study. So as you can see, it's not standardized. There are no perfect solutions and one size doesn't fit all. So to wrap up, well, it is predicted that half of the employees will need to be retrained and reskilled in the foreseeable future. It is also widely accepted that over the next decade, emerging technologies will reshape the world of work, and with the emergence of new types of jobs and as a result of digitalization. So micro-credentials might be a solution for reskilling and upskilling in light of the green and digital transition. There are universities that are already developing micro-credentials, for example, on sustainable cities and communities, rethinking climate risks and sustainability and climate change. Micro-credentials are themselves oftentimes provided with the use of digital technologies. I'm giving you several examples for inspiration. It is impossible to claim that the adopted European approach is a single solution to issues of lifelong learning or employability, but it can be a part of a solution in particular situations, including in the bioeconomy sector. That's all. Thank you very much for having me here.